Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 17. And today I'm joined by Ian Cooper, who's a polyglot coding architect in London, speaker and founder of the London.NET user group. And today we're going to be chatting all about TDD, test-driven development. So a massive welcome to the show, Ian. Thank you for joining us.
Hi Dan, good to see you.
Yeah, you too. It's good catching up again. I just realised actually then I didn't mention Brighter as well, because on your Twitter profile it says Gov of Brighter.
We can probably drop that into the conversation at some point.
Maybe. Well, if I don't put you off too much in this episode, it'd be quite a good one to have another episode on, I guess.
Yeah, that's true, actually. We should do that. Yeah, that'd be good. We're about to get V9 out of it out, and we'll start doing docs and stuff on the summer. Maybe it'd be good for us to do a bit of tramping the podcast circuit when we get V9 out to tell people about what's in there and what's changed and stuff.
Yeah, that'd be good, because I think episode 2 we had Derek Comartin talking about Mediator and CQRS, and Brighter definitely came into that conversation, so it'd be good to have an episode dedicated to it.
Yeah, okay.
Cool. So today we're going to chat about TDD, and Ian and I were discussing beforehand, and recently, a few years ago, I was working with a company, which was actually the first company I've worked for where everyone did TDD for everything. And we thought it would be good if I went through my experiences here, and then we both then dissected it as part of this conversation, the different bits and pieces. And I did see your talk at IO.NET virtual meetup about where TDD went wrong, and there was certainly a lot of stuff that resonated with me based on my experiences at this company.
I feel like the TDD doctor. I'm here to treat the patient, but yeah, let's do it.
Well, that's it. I think because I've seen quite a few of your different talks now over quite a few years now, and out of everyone that I can think of to get on the show talking about TDD, your name was just the first one that jumped to my head. So I'm so glad that you were good enough to find the time to join us.
No, I'm always kind of pleased to try and get the message out, because I think there's a whole lot of people who are struggling with TDD in ways they don't need to, and I'd really like to help them stop struggling. So it's really, really great to have the opportunity to do that here.
Nice. So look at my example then. So I've personally been developing for quite a long time, and I've tried to write testable code for quite a long time too. So like using like solid principles, dependency injection, blah, blah, blah. So this meant that when I started with this company, which was the first time I've actually done like proper TDD, I didn't really have a big technical learning curve as such, because I already knew how to write tests and testable code. I just hadn't done TDD full time. And there were quite a few like different observations I had along this journey. And the first one was like, whoa, we're spending like 90% of our time writing tests. I could have written this feature in like an hour, but we're spending days on it. But then I started to see the benefits, like we had hardly any bugs, which was a lot different than a lot of other large code bases I've worked on where we've had a massive buildup of bugs to fix at the end and big crunch periods. I also found that we could refactor more safely and the test would catch a lot of the things we broke. So it made quite a big difference there. But at what cost? It just took ages to write these tests. We could safely refactor, but the refactoring took ages too, because we had to refactor all the unit tests as well. But as well as doing unit tests, we were also writing integration tests. So this was ASP.NET Core Web API heavy, and we were using Docker to spin up the databases for the integration test to run against. And one thing I observed was that a lot of the time, the integration test would render a lot of the unit tests completely redundant. And I'd also find that the integration tests would be much more naturally requirement-based rather than testing implementation detail. They were faster to write and covered a lot more code. And also there were a lot less mocking required as well, which is something I'm sure we can go into later, the pros and cons of mocking. A bit later that year, I saw your Where Did TDD Go Wrong talk, and a lot of this resonated a lot with the experiences that I just kind of observed. I felt I learned quite a lot in that period about how I find I can do TDD without spending 95% of my time just writing tests, and the go live date almost being 3 years' time because of that.
So yeah, I mean, it obviously mirrors a lot of my experience. I mean, I started talking about TDD because I had similar experiences to you, and I went back to try and investigate the experience of TDD and where it came from for me. That's very much, I think it's a very common story. And what I did really to fathom my way through this, I went back and read Kent Beck's books. So Kent Beck, who's the kind of father of XP and the father of TDD, Kent always says he rediscovered them, right? He doesn't say, I rejected these ideas, I was someone that brought them to public attention. But his book, TDD by Example, I went and reread it. Now, it's an interesting book, TDD by Example, because I've seen some reviews saying, I didn't really understand TDD as a result of reading this book, don't get this book. And what's interesting is Ken had been doing TDD for a number of years at the time he wrote the book. And I think it is a book that is perhaps more powerful for people that have done a little bit of TDD already to kind of explain how TDD ought to be working, almost like a more of a masterclass in getting TDD right. So to go back to your kind of problem space, right? It happened to me a lot, right? Big test suites, first ship version seems to be fantastic, high quality, low defect, hard to maintain because every change requires making a lot of change to these test code, often 3 times as much test code as real code, slow, product owners saying, couldn't we skip the test this time around? That kind of really common experience. So, you know how they refer to sometimes null as being the kind of $1 billion bug or whatever, effectively? I think TDD has a kind of $1 billion bug equivalent, and that's the word unit test. So what's interesting is if you go and read Kent Beck's book, is he never talks about unit tests. He just talks about tests. He has one kind of moment in the book where he uses the word unit test, and it's basically to say, tests as I describe them here are not unit tests. And he says, though, although I sometimes refer to them as unit tests, what he means is verbally, in conversation, he occasionally will talk about unit tests. But the practice of TDD is not around unit tests. So what I want to do is take a step back and understand what unit tests are. So in classical testing methodology, what you do when you're testing a system, usually in the test after model, so in waterfall, someone's built most of the system, QA is now going to look at it, is the QA team would come along and the system would be divided into modules, whatever a module is going to be, right, in our system, may depend on our platform and language. And they treat the module as a black box. And they'd say, I want to test this module works. And I want to put things into the module, get things out in the module, and check for the inputs I put in, I get the right outputs. Now, in order to make sure that any problems with this module are this module, then I declare the module to be a unit, and I isolate from any other modules, right? So that notion of saying, I'm going to use some kind of mock or stub to replace all the dependencies of this module, so I know that if there's a defect, it's caused inside this black box. That's unit testing. And of course, it's only one module in my system. So then what I need to do is essentially say, well, what happens when these two modules talk to each other, right? I know this one works on its own, this one works on its own. What happens when they talk to each other? Well, that's an integration test. And the purpose of an integration test is just, well, it isn't a problem in module A or in module B. I've got tests that work for those. So if a test now fails, it's the integration between the two modules that's incorrect. Then you get to a system test, which says, when I have all these integrated modules working together, then essentially I can prove the whole system works. And that's a really valid approach to doing testing, but it has nothing to do with test-driven development. And the problem was we took these ideas and said, well, what's the unit from TDD? Oh, well, it's got to be a class. It'll be the class, right? Great. So I need to isolate my class so that I can localize all defects that I get in testing to be in that class, which means I have to mock out any other class that I deal with. And as a result of mocking out every class that I deal with, that means I have to inject all the other classes that I deal with. And I'm a good OO programmer. I want lots of classes that have just one kind of responsibility. So that means if this thing needs to talk to other things, I'm going to have to get to a whole load of things. Wow, I've got this massive graph of things I need to inject. I better build a tool that does that. I'll call it an inversion of control container, right? And this whole edifice is really built around this notion that I'm doing unit testing, right? And we've built a huge amount of cost into all the systems we design because of this idea of unit testing. All right. So what I want to tell people is that is not how TDD works. So test-driven development focuses on something that the TDD community back in the noughties coined the term developer or programmer test for. And developer or programmer test says this: I have some kind of requirement. Usually, let's say in an agile world, that's some kind of user story or a lightweight use case, but it can be anything you want. Someone wants you to build something, right? And in order to build that thing, it has some acceptance criteria. When you've built this thing, all these, it passes all these acceptance criteria. And generally, what I'm doing with something like TDD is I'm saying, okay, I want to pick one of these acceptance criteria such that I can write the smallest amount of code I can towards implementing this requirement. So I pick the smallest bit I can because I want to work incrementally. I just want to make a little change, test, make a little change, test. So I'll pick the thing that gives me the smallest possible version of that requirement, right? And quite often what people do is they start with something that says like, I need to get something that basically just spins up a test, right? So I quite often, when I teach this a bit, I use the example of Game of Life, right? In Game of Life, you worry about the rules, but you have a board, you apply some rules, you get a new board, apply some rules, and effectively cells live or die. And I always say, well, the first test you probably want to start with is dead board produces dead board, right? Really simple requirement. What it gets me is writing a very tiny amount of code. And that code is based off requirements. It's not based off, here's a class, I want to do a method. The problem is if I say I want to test this class, implicitly I've done some design around my implementation. I must have thought about what classes am I going to use to implement this requirement. I've done that thinking up front. And what it turns out is it's very hard for me to unwind that thinking. I get very wedded to that thought process, and I see the problem in the context of that thought process. And what that leads quite often to me doing is writing a lot of speculative code, because it turns out I didn't need this for this requirement, but hey, in my head plan of how this will work, I've got all those classes mapped out, right? So generally, in a kind of unit testing approach, you'd start with saying, oh, here's one of the classes I need. It's going to need these kind of methods. I'll write some tests against it. In a TDD approach, you say, what's the first requirement I can think of? So I'm doing Game of Life. The first requirement is I want to have a board. If the board has no living cells on it, then when I run a tick, as it's called in the game, I should get another dead board, right? And then I just keep going with requirements. And what this leads to is what TDD is actually trying to achieve. And the first thing is design. So I always say TDD is a contract first design approach. In the same way, we go out there and we say things like, hey, a really good way of designing your API, your HTTP API, we drop an open API, Swagger document, effectively, share that with the customer, get feedback, play with it as a mock, decide what the shape looks like, then go and implement it. Because, hey, that way I get all this feedback before I need to actually go and write all the code, right? In the same way with test-driven development, we want to be contract first like that. So we say, well, what's the API that's going to implement these requirements? Hey, I can sketch that out in my test. I haven't got an implementation yet, so it's easy to change, right? When I'm happy with what that looks like, then I can begin saying I could get that to pass, that kind of that first example, right? So once upon a time in XP, there was this notion saying, oh, you're not going to need documentation anymore. The test will be documentation. And I found I thought it was one of the great lies. I looked at my test 6 months later and I had no idea what this test was doing, right? Turns out if you do TDD like this, if you treat it as I'm creating examples that express the acceptance criteria, then one of the things you focus on is, hey, I want to create a really readable example. I want to be able to look at this test and read it as a stranger to my system and go, that's how you use this particular system, right? So I write that test and another test. And it isn't necessarily one particular class I'm getting under control. Now, when you see examples, so Ron Jeffries is a really good person to see him doing this online. When you see Ron doing examples, he's obviously tends to be dealing with a class, but that class is the one that expresses the API, right? So he's dealing with the API and just happens to be expressed by a class. When we say API, by the way, we don't necessarily mean a thing at the boundary of system, HTTP or some event-based system. We mean effectively probably what I would think of in a layered sense as the service layer, the thing that sits over my domain and provides a more coarse-grained operation.
One of the talks I saw you did quite a few years back, you were talking a lot about outside-in testing. So where the outside is this boundary you're talking about.
Yeah, sure. And that's very true. I mean, outside-in testing is a bit of a term for BDD. We'll come back to BDD later. So I've moved away from it a bit. I tend to think more now in terms of clean architecture and testing at a port. It's a bit of an easier term, or a service layer if you think about that kind of classic, application layer, service layer, and domain basically. So you can't test at that level because that's basically where your requirement is expressed most naturally in the code, right? So you write test now, and then what you just do is keep adding tests. to basically increase the amount of coverage of examples. Now, the thing is that you might say, well, hang on a minute. How is the localization of my defect? If something goes wrong, if I write some code and then I get red tests, how do I know what broke? Because if this is quite coarse grained at this kind of level. And the answer with TDD is the last change you made is what broke something. Right? So TDD's principle is that developer tests, in unit tests, it's basically a red test indicates that basically there's a defect in this module. In TDD, a red test indicates there is a defect in the last change that you made. And actually, a lot of TDD practitioners are quite aggressive, and they say revert the last change and try again. I'm a little bit more like, maybe debugging is actually the quickest route to find. Maybe it's a trivial error. Have a look for trivial errors that debugging will show up first of all, and then if you really think I didn't understand that, my debugging is showing I didn't understand it, then revert it and try again. Right. But it's also why TDD wants to make small changes so you don't feel worried about throwing it away. If you switch to this model of developer testing, you'll find a couple of things happen. One is you'll get TDD code where it forms an example and you can use that effectively to understand what it is that you're writing. Two, if you think about basically this kind of layered architecture where effectively you've got the application as your controller, some kind of service layer and then domain underneath it, you'll have a clear kind of service boundary that says I express high-level operations on the domain easily to the application. The other thing you'll find is that you don't need mocks very much. We'll talk about where mocks come in, but you don't tend to need mocks. Why? Well, actually, what you do when you implement that API is the first thing you do in the red, green refactor cycle. Remember, red is write a failing test. So I write my test, which is an example of how the system ought to be used. I write that example. Then what I'm supposed to do to go green is as quickly as possible. So cut and paste from Stack Overflow, whatever you need. I effectively get that test to go green. So I'm figuring out the algorithm that basically passes that test. But I don't do good design at that point. I figure it out. And then what happens is, as I begin to get my software emerging to meet the requirements, I can at some point say, I could refactor this. Now I have a clearer idea of what the code needs to do. I can see that I could improve the design. Generally, I leave that quite a bit of time nowadays because I'm waiting to see that I've got the requirements met before I get into refactoring it, right? And I find leaving it later really helps. There's a really great book which talks through the process of how you do refactoring. One of the things it's trying to get us away from is premature complexity. I did that exercise a few years ago in the book. You start by running, it tells you basically you write 99 bottles, basically. I did it, and I realized by comparison to their solution that although I had what we might think of as well-engineered code with factories, dispensing lines, etc., it was hugely overcomplicated. When I looked at their code, even though essentially you might think of it as much closer to being just a script that implements it, it was far clearer when you came to look at it later what that code was doing, right? Far, far clearer. I'd add all these levels of abstraction internally to simplify stuff, but I didn't need all that. The second thing effectively in that refactoring step is you may introduce classes that are effectively internal in C# terms, or effectively because the API is effectively the public interface over these internal collaborator classes, and they don't need tests. The thing is, when you refactor, it's a safe move that says, I'm going to make this safe kind of refactoring that essentially won't introduce new paths. So anything I introduce, like putting this particular operation into a method, moving that method into its own class because it's a separate responsibility, right, is covered by the original test. I'm not writing code that wasn't created in response to the original test, and therefore it's covered by the original test. And that design element, I've chosen to break this into two classes. Someone else might say later, you know what, I'm going to merge those two together. They're not carrying their weight, or actually we need 4 here, etc. And those things are the flexible part of refactoring. If we have tests pointing to those, that's where we have to go away and change our tests at that point. We don't want to do that. So our tests, we don't want them to couple to the implementation details, because if we do that, our tests become an obstacle to refactoring, not a thing that helps us do that. So instead, we just test against that kind of top level, the coarse-grained interface, and then we say, okay, I can then change that implementation as much as I want as I learn more about how this code works, how easy it is to maintain, etc. It's perfectly acceptable quite often to wait quite a while. I've got some code I'm writing in a minute, and I've got a little note for other people saying this is going to need refactoring, but I'm not at the end of figuring out the algorithm yet. I'm talking to people, trying to figure out with them if this is doing the right thing. Talking to people this code is supposed to be working for. When I'm happy, we know what this does. Then we blitz the refactoring. We say, okay, let's make this easier to read and maintain. Other people need to look at this other than us. Let's be much clearer about the intent. Let's remove duplication, the big one. Remove duplication, express intent. Those are the two really big ones you can do. If you want design patterns, that's where it comes in. It says, clearly I have the context for a design pattern here. I'm not just creating a design pattern for the sake of it because I like design patterns and they're cool. I can clearly see I'd actually be able to implement this more clearly with a design pattern.
This is one thing I quite like about being able to utilize Docker to get rid of testing implementation detail, to spin up a database instead of having to use something like a tightly coupled in-memory database, because then things like whether you're using NT Framework or Dapper or the repository pattern or whatever data access classes you may have, which are all implementation detail, you can take that completely out of the equation. And what I'm trying to do now is in my integration test, I quite often use ASP.NET Core, so I'm using the Web Application Factory. And the requirement is that, say, for example, an order management system where we're creating an order, the test is if I make a post request to an endpoint, then the test itself checks the database to make sure that an order entry has been added. And then that's taken out of the equation what ORM I'm using, what data layers I'm using, so I can completely swap those over. The tests which are testing the requirement still work, and I don't have to rewrite all those. And that's the problem I found where we're doing lots of unit tests against each layer. It was those things that broke while the integration test just carried on working.
Yeah, so I tend to move away from terminology like integration tests because that goes with unit tests and being hand in hand. So I talk about developer tests, right? And then I talk about testing, right? And sometimes I talk about test-driven development and test after testing to make it a bit clearer for people. So one of the things I tend to say is that the TDD works really well for the following circumstance, right? Which is generally you're testing your domain and you're testing it potentially through a more coarse-grained interface over that domain. And the reason I like things like clean architecture, that kind of style, is because effectively that says, well, all the ports that come in and go out effectively are at a different layer. And my tests just drive that domain. And I don't really care about the other details because effectively my tests can kind of supply those. Now, sometimes you can have use of the kind of like database layer, some entity gateway or a repository pattern. And you say in my coarse-grained layer, actually one of the first things it does is get data. Sometimes I will provide a dummy that does that for me. And that gets us into the kind of like next section, which is, should you ever use mocks at all? If we say TDD doesn't really do mocking, it basically doesn't ever isolate stuff. So Kent's rule about TDD is it's fast binary feedback. And his idea was basically it should be fast and doesn't break your flow. And it's binary red or green, right? There's no kind of maybe. So Kent said there are three things that cause us a problem, right? And we know this around any project you work on, right? One is things that he called shared fixture. So shared fixture is essentially where there is a state that would be shared between two tests so that I can't run those tests in parallel easily, which slows them down. And I/O is classically one of them, or statics, basically, etc. The other thing basically is slow tests, which may be caused by I/O, etc., quite often, or across a network boundary. And the third one is fragile tests that basically don't behave the same every single time. So may have issues around threading, or it may also be I/O related and erratic I/O. And those are the places where Kent would tend to, if he needed to, use a mock, right? Saying, actually, it's kind of okay to replace those things. And so generally speaking, it's often I/O you want to replace. But as you say, if you design your tests right, quite often you can just exclude I/O from the equation. You can say the I/O happens somewhere else. My TDD doesn't need to deal with that. I'm just giving it data and I'm getting back results. And my test can drive that and set up and tear down. Sometimes it's useful to have a data access layer abstraction, which basically says, actually, my coarse-grained layer, I will talk to data access, get some data, and then pop it basically across. Depends on your preference. I'm okay with that if you need it. But yeah, you're tending to exclude that problem. And then what I say to people is this, right? I say, if you want to go and test, for example, do I use entity framework correctly And will I persist my stuff to entity framework? Write a test for that, for sure. But recognize what you're doing. You're effectively writing a regression test to say, I've got some code that I'm worried may break. So I'm going to automate some regression tests for that bit of my code, which effectively checks whether or not basically I map correctly. And that's a separate test, and it's a test after test, and it's nothing to do with your TDD practice. It's just you're doing testing, right? And that's why I tend to talk about the test pyramid as well at this point, saying there's unit tests. It's great for us to test the business logic of our application using TDD. But there are other layers which basically effectively give us slower feedback and sometimes less binary feedback, but are also valuable in terms of us assessing the overall quality of the application. So one of those is anything that touches I/O. You may want to write a separate test to basically check that I/O stuff will work. And as you say, one way you can do that, I find, is, like, as you say, basically write something in Postman or even use REST client in code, or there's an HTTP facility in something like Rider, which basically does the same thing, say something like Postman does, which fires through a system test through and says, well, it will break, right? I don't tend to test controllers separately because that would break. That gives me a test that gives me fast feedback that tells me the result of that. I can use XUnit tools if I want to automate driving my tests around my EF core or my Dapper layer. But it's just a separate test. And I often say, I'm not doing TDD because TDD is an exploration activity. I don't know what this interface looks like. I don't quite know what code I want to write. The requirement's going to tell me. If I'm just doing something that says hook up to EF core, I know what code I've got to write. It's documented, and I'm just filling out some numbers. There's no exploration going on here. There's no refactoring going on here. I'm just writing it, right? And I can test after works fine for that. Same with, I find, with user interfaces. There's a little point in trying to TDD a user interface. What am I adding buttons one by one as I explore the interface? Generally, I'm not. Generally, some UX designer has given me something that says, make it look like this. So I have the requirement. The API is already designed. There's no design. There's no scope control. I'm still implementing the details. And generally speaking, those tests are fragile and slow. So use something like a tool that's built for testing front ends, like Selenium or something like that, and test that front end that way, and do it in a test after style, right? And so use TDD where it's meant to be used, which is, hey, I want to explore the business logic I need to solve this problem. TDD will help me basically, and I say business logic, application logic of some sort, effectively. And for other areas of my overall stack, where I want to be assured that once I get it working, it won't regress, write tests that basically help protect me against regression and that are automated for sure, but it's not TDD, even if I use some of the same tools to do it, right? And I think that really helps you, because sometimes it's this thing of the goal of TDD is the same goal in all Agile, which is speed up the feedback loop, get feedback on design decisions earlier. So in TDD, the design decision I'm making is get an interface that looks a bit like this to implement my requirement, get feedback on that design decision, right? Obviously, if the UX is basically looks like this, the fastest way to get a design decision, maybe actually a feedback, maybe to basically get that working, spin it up, stick it in front of somebody. That's the fast design decision I'm making. And the feedback is generally not binary, it's nuanced, right? And what I'm trying to do there is release code. That's how I'm testing that. If it's just basically, does this hook up to Dapper? So often, it's basically just write the code and run it, as you say, against Docker, see if it works, right? That's often a much faster way to run it, is much faster than to say, write a whole test suite, right? And so it's always about what's the fastest way of getting the feedback that I've done this right? What's the fastest way to figure that out? And do the fastest thing. If TDD is not the fastest way to do that, do something else that is, right? TDD is not, don't make it a cargo cult. Make it something that says, here is a really valuable way of me getting feedback on design. It also gives you scope control, right? That's really important, because one of the other problems I'd seen with unit testing is that because people create unit tests, they have to then say, well, how does the whole thing fit together? All these units. I've got all these units. How do I know that actually meets the functional requirement? So then they get into say, BDD or ATDD, using tools like SpecFlow, or in the past it was Fit, to write all these tests, right, at a higher level. And there are two problems with them. First of all, they tend to use some kind of DSL to write English language tests or table-based tests, right? And the assumption is that the product owner will review these and look at them in wonder and go, look, the requirements I established, they're automated and proved, right? And it's like, well, I've never seen anyone do that. I've never seen product owners actually sit there and review the spec flow tests and say, actually, that isn't quite the requirement I expressed to you. And they cost a lot because I have to translate between that DSL and code. But what I should really be doing is taking the examples I'm given and using those to drive my TDD practice. So there's no difference anymore. They are a given when then is really how you express TDD. And I've got a slide deck that I use. I'll give you a link, Dan. You can put it in the podcast at the end. And one of the things to talk about there is the fact that someone called James Shaw, who was one of the people who wrote Fit originally and a big advocate of XP still, and he talks about the fact that he gave up on it and just said, create examples that effectively then drive your actual TDD practice. It's all the same thing. It's just developer tests. Developer tests function at the level expressing requirements. You don't need ATTD, BDD. It's all part of this separation into unit, integration, acceptance. It's not anything to do with TDD. TDD says clearly express that requirement in the unit test of the application logic that I need to get. I need to prove out. Hey, let's write some other tests or release code and get telemetry feedback to prove all the other parts of the system where effectively TDD is not the right answer.
Yeah, I really like what you were saying about SpecFlow actually, because I've considered using that in the past with different companies, and my kind of thoughts really echoed what you just said, where it's nice in principle, but in reality, there's no way the stakeholders would have gone through writing SpecFlow tests. It would have been the developers, and the developers know how to write the given when XUnit tests anyway.
Right, exactly. The given when then format. I mean, I tend to quite often just use it as act arrange assert, which is the same thing. And actually, any XUnit framework that gives you setup, test, teardown is actually doing the same thing, right? So one of my other tips is, one of the problems I find with some of the given when then style frameworks is the focus of my test should be the API under test. If you're using and I've done it in the past, an XUnit framework, which basically gives you a kind of DSL, the problem can be is that your test is focused on the DSL, not on what the API looks like. And so you don't get that thing where when you write your test, you're saying, what should this API look like? Where's an example of how I use that API? What I get instead is this given when then, well, and it's quite obscure. I can't see the API. It's hidden away somewhere else. So I kind of dislike those nowadays because to me they are obscuring the API under test. And the point of TDD is it's a contract first approach, right? It's a contract first design approach saying, what is the API that satisfies these requirements? Can I implement that and prove that my implementation works? Can I control myself that I only write code that is necessary to pass that requirement? Because the other thing we do as developers, we complicate stuff. We add tons of unnecessary code in, and we tell ourselves, "Oh, future me will be really grateful," because future me, when the product owner inevitably has to come and implement that requirement, future me will be able to go, "I've already done that," and deliver it fast. And the trouble is, what future me always finds is, I kind of got it half right, but the requirement's not quite what I thought. And then future me's in this bind because half of future me is going, well, I've already got a working solution to that, so I'll just hack it and it'll actually work. And my beautiful code becomes ugly code because it's hacks I made to make. Here's one I made earlier actually work for the real situation I've got, right? And the reality is, if I just waited until I genuinely knew that requirement, it would be better because I'd actually now be writing better code. And also that requirement may never come. And the smell, it's the classic smell where you come across a bit of code and you enable some new requirement, and then things go red, and then it's like, wow, there are lines of code here that can never possibly have actually been run because they never worked.
Yeah, I quite often find, because I use Rider quite heavily, which is very much more in your face about suggesting warnings and things that code that's not being called a lot. And I do find lots of times when I'm looking at code bases, there's whole chunks of code which just never been called anywhere.
Yeah.
And it's just over time, refactoring has taken place and things have just been left in there. And go into your example before about over-engineering things. And I suppose the whole acronym YAGNI, you ain't going to need it, definitely fits there, because I see a lot of code where it's almost like the developers that have written it are trying to be clever by thinking, oh, I can solve this in a really clever way, but it ends up being overly complicated, unmaintainable, and really hard to read.
I mean, there's a couple of problems here, I think. And one of them, as I recognize as I get older, right, is that younger me, when younger me often thought he had two audiences for his code. One was it runs and therefore the product owner is happy. The other was the other developers in the team, and you wanted to impress them with your cleverness, right? And hey, I know how to use all the features of C#9, and there's a couple of edge cases that give you really powerful effects, and I'm going to show people how you do that. And older me is tired of all that and is like, I'd rather have code that uses the simplest possible approach to solving the problem, because other people like me are going to have to maintain it, and I can't. It's that thing where you go back and look at your code 6 months ago and you go, wow, did I write that? And either it's like, did I write that? I'm an idiot, or I wrote that. I was smarter then. I must have lost those brain cells. But I find that code that's basically overly clever, it can be a problem. But I think also more of it is all of us have our own weaknesses, right? And one of the reasons I like going back to the book 99 Bottles of Oop, I find quite powerful is having done that exercise. You write it yourself, and then you compare it to the solution. Is I recognize I have a tendency to introduce abstractions earlier than they're needed, and because if you know that, then I can say to myself when I feel the urge to refactor already, I can say, wait longer. Wait longer because you tend to abstract too fast, right? You know that's your bad habit. So wait longer. You've got tests. You can refactor at any point. You've got good tests covering this, and that means at any point you can break out new methods to express intent, new classes if you need to simplify things. But you don't need to do that until at the point where you're sure that, hey, this has really become hard to follow now. And so, hey, what are the simplest refactorings I can do to help me get to the next kind of phase? And always ask yourself, what's the simplest refactoring I could do here? What's the smallest bit of clarity? And that's why Kent, I think, focused a lot on duplication. And by the way, one thing to always be clear about duplication is it's not duplicated lines of code, it's duplication of knowledge. So 2 bits of code know how to do the same thing. You can have lots of lines that say, string.format or whatever, etc. That's not duplication. You have to further abstract that, right? It's 2 bits of code that say, hey, this bit of code and this bit of code both know how to do the same thing, right? Hey, I should abstract that. Or express method to express intent, the other one, which is I've added comments because it's unclear. Actually, I can maybe if I just do a renaming and create the method name, that will replace the comments. Those two alone are quite powerful, right? Before I get into strategy pattern or command pattern or other stuff which I love, I need to take a step back and say, does Ian need to do that? Because you have a tendency to reach for that because you know how to do it, but do you need to do that yet? And good TDD helps you do that, right? Because good TDD says, I'm up against this higher layer. I don't have to have designed out this beautiful class structure. And also that beautiful class structure is a mutable thing. It's a thing that can change. It's an implementation detail. Especially in C#, one of the things things I push back about, which have become received wisdom in the C# community, which I think are wrong. One of them is don't use multiple assemblies. And my attitude is, what? If you're a Python programmer, no one's going to say to you, don't use modules. If you're a Go programmer, it's going to say, you don't use modules. Assemblies are your module structure, right? If anything you put public on your assembly says, hey, I am the thing you talk to on the coarse grained interface. Anything internal is hidden from collaborators, right? The public stuff on the assembly, that's what your tests talk to. The internal stuff, they don't talk to. One of the things about writing a lot of code, a lot of tests, you significantly reduce the number of tests if all I'm testing is that public interface. And I leave those implementation details well alone, right? I significantly improve my refactoring. I leave those implementation details well alone. So do use assemblies. Break stuff up in a modular fashion, right? Think about people like Dave Parnass, basically, when he talks about how to break stuff into modules, generally put things that change together, right? And get modules that have basically great cohesion and low coupling, and use assemblies as modules, right? That absolutely do not take away that weapon of computer science. Now, obviously, you need a sufficient amount of complexity to do that, but I'd say even the most non-trivial apps quickly get to the point where a module would help them, right? People also don't use layers. People misunderstand layers, right? Layers do basically two things. One is they say, let's not have circular references basically between our modules, right? So what one exists for. The other thing is let's make it easy to reason about modules in the modules at this layer do different things to modules at that layer. That's all they do, right? Lots of people get very excited about layers and modules, but they're pretty fundamental bits of computer science that are very useful tools. So I definitely push back heavily against this. Some of this received wisdom in the C# community of, oh, don't use assemblies, just put it all in one big assembly and have folders. Folders don't give you public and internal. Then some people go to you when you push back and they say, well, you can go and use X tool to basically reinforce folder-based boundaries. And I'm like, why? The language has given you assemblies. What is wrong with you using assemblies to do that? Why are you going away and using Ninject module loading assemblies or whatever they're called, effectively, etc.? And the other thing, effectively, with TDD, if you do it right at this level, is you may not need anything more than poor man's DI, right? You can new stuff up because essentially you can new stuff up in the constructor because you're no longer injecting it in order to mock it. So in a lot of cases, you don't need to effectively inject it at all because it never changes. I'm always using one of those. I can new it up, right? And I can new up in layers things that the layer below needs from me as an interface. I can new it up. So there's only a small number of things at the composition root, as we call it, that actually genuinely need creation, and you may be able to new those up too. And that means you don't need complicated IOC frameworks in most cases. And particularly if you're building like something that's essentially running in for AWS Lambda, or I guess the same would be true. I don't do Azure's kind of serverless stuff, but I guess it'd be the same. You don't want complicated IOC in that, right? You basically just want to do something that new stuff up, potentially once in a kind of static, and then effectively every time it gets called, you've just got a short composition route and a chain of stuff to do, right? IOC containers, a lot of the problem we have with them is they arrived because of unit testing style TDD. Move away from that. Move to developer testing. Simplify, new stuff up. Perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with new stuff up. Only inject stuff if it's essentially created in a layer above you, and therefore you can't create an instance of it because you want to avoid problems with cyclic graphs. It can change. So it's basically you're using some kind of approach to the strategy pattern where effectively I could provide multiple implementations of this. Otherwise, just new it. Create an instance of it.
So do you find that not worrying about IOC containers and not focusing on unit tests means that it's easier to also start writing tests against more legacy code bases?
That's a good question. All right. So legacy code bases, it can be easier to write something against because you're effectively just saying I can write a test that gets this kind of under control. The difficulty with legacy code bases is quite often finding the point at which to write the test. And it may depend. If you've got a legacy code base that has some kind of level of layers, actually that may be quite easy. If you've got a decent service layer below your controller, you can definitely write tests there if you need to get it under control. If it's kind of a bit, and I've seen some of the code bases that are chaotic, they don't even have the basics of layers, that can be hard work, right? To me, it's one of the things of, why do I like a layered structure that effectively has the ports, in other words, the things that do I/O above the domain model and not in the domain model? Why do I like to keep my domain clean of I/O concerns? That's because I've worked with code in the past, which would, at some point, you're doing business logic, call store procedure, business logic, call store procedure. And what happens is that becomes very hard to maintain, I find, because it's very hard to know when they call this bit of code, what's it going to do? Is it fast? Is it actually going to call out to a database halfway through? If I start a transaction, what am I encompassing? And when I work those codes, that's a real problem, particularly the whole thing about database transactions, right? What am I going to encompass? Where can I start and end a transaction? And some of those code bases are almost impossible to get a transaction in them. So I tend to prefer to keep the domain, what we call plain old C# objects, clean of all those I/O concerns, move those outside. And then my tests, I find I don't need to worry about that stuff mostly. And if I do want to write a test at a more coarse grain level that includes that, I do quite often then use in memory or something. But I tend to find quite often, as you do, that I can just write something that runs with Postman or whatever, effectively. And to be honest with you, even better than Postman nowadays, you can use curl and JQ in a bash script quite often as well, all right? It's amazing how much actually effective testing you could do with curl and JQ and a bash script nowadays. But yeah, assemble at that level outside.
When I was talking about using Docker and stuff, that was still in an automated fashion, but using like the ASP.NET Core integration tests.
Yeah.
And then automatically using like Docker Compose to spin up the database temporarily, run the integration tests, although I'll avoid the word integration tests, and then spinning down the database afterwards.
Yeah, so most of the project, Brighter does that, right? So one thing about Brighter is we abstract multiple what we call transports, so basically different messaging middleware and databases, because in some cases we support outboxes and inboxes. We've got multiple ones of those. So the core engine has a kind of TDD set of tests, right? Because it's the same regardless of what transport you use or what database you use. And those things, there was an interface that we implement, right, for that given piece of middleware, of that messaging framework, effectively, or for the basically that database. And so we have automated tests, X unit tests, but they're generally quite often written in a very test afterish fashion. They're proving that, yeah, effectively, you do implement this interface correctly for us. We do exactly the same with that. We basically have a Docker Compose file. We have a big one if you've got enough memory in your machine, or small individual ones otherwise. And then essentially we spin that up, and you can run, that's part of our GitHub repo, so you can run a test suite that tests all of our transports if you want to, and prove that they work. And actually we use GitHub Actions now, basically, and it's effectively doing the same thing there, right? Basically spin up containers to run those individual test suites that rely on that particular dependency. So our build does the core tests, which basically don't have those IO dependencies, builds and runs those core tests. And then we have a whole load of container-based tests that basically say, run this test suite, which has a dependency on this particular IO subsystem that we've put in a Docker container, and then you can basically play with it that way. And that works really, really well, and stops you having to install it on your machine, makes it very easy to get new contributors started on your project, because essentially they just pull down everything. They can run the unit test locally, and then they can, if they want to run the whole suite of tests, just use Docker Compose or whatever effectively to spin up the required infra.
I'm finding just so many different use cases for Docker. Like the more I use it, it's just even like building it in Docker, so you don't have to have the latest .NET SDK or a node on the build agent. And as you said, just being able to temporarily spin up test infrastructure, run the tests and tear it down. And it's just so powerful. And this whole CI/CD modern way of doing things, where it's all like driven by Git commits, and then you can just go and get a coffee and it goes and does its own thing. I just love this nowadays.
I mean, we used to have, I can remember at places I've worked at before, right, where generally speaking, you arrived as a new dev and it took you 2 days to create your machine before you could do any work, because you had to install all this stuff, right?
Been there.
And even if you were lucky, at one place I worked, Ian Battersby, I think, wrote it originally, and then Toby Henderson kind of maintained it at Huddle. There was a chocolatey kind of script that you could run that would basically set up your machine and install it. But of course, that was only as good as the last person that actually ran the thing, right? And then people would add new requirements and forget to update the script. And so
that might have been 2 years ago as well, I guess.
Right, yeah. We had a script that was perfect for the next sort of like person, actually. And then we tried doing some stuff where we would basically get Vagrant running and try deploying a Vagrant box and running to try and keep this script fresh, etc. And it all went away with Docker. So yeah, here's the Docker Compose file. That installs most of what you need to run our stuff, right? You can grab a repo. You can as long as you got Docker, the Docker Compose file, put stuff in, you're good to go. I can't remember where it is now, but Huddle also had a tool that was open sourced. I wish I could remember its name now. One of our devs, Dom Green, worked on, where essentially the idea was, because you had multiple microservices, if you wanted to basically deploy other people's microservices to test your microservice, essentially everybody else's microservice basically was in a Docker container. So you could effectively spin up our entire system, and then you ran yours locally, talking to all the Docker containers that held all the other microservices basically that you needed to talk to. It was hooked into Octopus deploy, and you could effectively deploy live as it was, or you could basically say, actually, I want to deploy live plus the version in staging for this other microservice, etc. It was really sweet. I wish I could remember what it's called now. I'll dig it out, Dan, and I'll put a link. I'll dig out where it is, and that's quite powerful. And I think people things like is it Tier or Try? What's the one from the .NET team?
Oh, the new .NET one, Project Tie.
Yeah, Project Tie. Yeah, which essentially I think is working on top of Kubernetes, which is trying to do a similar sort of thing, right? help you deploy your entire app locally so that you can test the bit you've got in that. And it is really powerful for developers because stuff that otherwise just took you days of installing stuff on your machine, and at some point you had to just repave your machine to try and, has become replaced entirely with this model, and it's pretty powerful.
Yeah, I've definitely worked for companies before where, like you describe, it takes days to get set up. And I remember one in particular quite a few years ago where I started, and the first couple of days trying to run all the setup scripts, and it kept on failing. Then the leads on the team, a couple of them came over and were trying to get involved, trying to work out what's going on. They were the leads of the team, and they couldn't work out what was wrong with their scripts. And as you say,
Yeah,
it could have been like
yeah,
a months or a year ago since it was last run. So it ended up being
yeah,
this really mammoth thing just to get me to build some code on the computer.
yeah. I mean, hopefully we're all starting to use Docker and Thai, etc., effectively move away from that model a little bit, right? And also, it just ruins your machine because at some point the only way out usually becomes to repave the whole thing. And only people that used to always do development on VMs, so they could just create a VM. They had basically a kind of gold image. You create the VM, do all your development there, and then effectively when you'd ruined it enough, you blow it away and create a new VM. And Docker's just really become the people use Vagrant for doing that, right? And Docker's become really the equivalent of doing that now, I think, which is just spin up everything I need in containers, and then I can blow it away effectively when I'm done with it, or just purge all my containers and start again if I need to.
I think one problem is like the world we live in, where like, we're both user group organizers. We'd like pay attention to what's going on quite heavily, and we're actually in a small percentage of developers that do that. And so we're thinking that Docker's been around for a while. Like containers is just the way to do things. CI/CD is the way to do things. A lot of places I see just that they're not there yet, and they're still doing the old way we're describing now. A lot of companies are still in that world.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, also, I think we always also underestimate how many people work at small or medium-sized businesses where the constant day-to-day pressure to deliver means that your head's down, your ability to get heads up and learn about Docker because you believe that you've heard from somebody that it could simplify your problem space is quite often quite, it's quite difficult to ask for the time to be able to go away and learn that stuff. And even if you did, if you haven't necessarily been through all the kind of experiences people have, it can take quite a while between starting to learn it and then delivering a lot of extra value. And I think we do underestimate how long it can take for the ideas to become mainstream enough, tooling to become helpful enough that for most devs it becomes a bit of a no-brainer. I can just do that now. Or people come from larger orgs to the smaller org where they effectively bring those practices with them because they've already done a lot of that learning and they can teach people. But you're right. Yeah, we do underestimate how many people work in orgs where there's just them, right? Or them and two or three other people, and they are snowed under with product requirements, let alone improve the automation of their infrastructure.
So we are actually almost running out of time. So shall we do dev tips?
Yeah, let's do one. So what I was going to recommend was a plugin for your browser called Guitarco. Again, I'll give you a link so you can share that with everybody at the end. Um, I was introduced to this by a colleague called George Armstrong at Joystick Technology where I work. And what it does for you is when you're on a GitHub repo on the web browser, in the left hand of the browser display, it gives you a tree structure to navigate the code, which is so cool because sometimes what you want to do is talk to a colleague about some code, and rather than have to basically spin up your IDE, share your IDE, particularly in this kind of time, actually, what you really want to do is just go to the repo and just navigate your way through the repo, showing code, and it works beautifully for that. And also, if you want to explore the repo and find something, rather than download all the code, put it in your IDE just so you get a nice tree structure, this thing does it out of the box for you. And it hasn't killed either of my browsers yet in the way that
That's always a
we're
good
running
sign.
out of memory. Yeah, we're running out of memory because basically you've got too many tabs open, but it seems fine. So it's really powerful Guitarco, and I found it to be invaluable for discussing code with colleagues or just quickly needing to find something in a repo that I wanted to draw attention to, etc.
Very nice. And I don't know, I've not tried this yet, but I know there's a whole bunch of things in GitHub that are fairly new about being able to spin up an ID in the browser. I can't remember what it's called, but I don't know whether that ties into being able to like avoid the problem you're describing of having to clone the code or get the latest, open up your IDE, whether like you can like just keep in this browser world. I really can't remember the name of it though.
Isn't it? I thought, wasn't it to do with, wasn't it like developer spaces or something, code spaces?
Code Spaces, that was it.
Yeah, I haven't tried code spaces either, but yeah, it definitely does seem as though it's quite powerful. Like it's in early access right now, so not everyone will have seen it, but you can request early access for code spaces. My mental model, which could be completely wrong, is that it's kind of Visual Studio Code plugged into GitHub, but I don't know whether that's true or not. And I could just be maybe the name in code and spaces is confusing me. One of the things is that when you go and sign up for it, it asks you what language you're interested in, and GitHub, I find if you're a C# developer, despite it now being owned by Microsoft, tends to kind of like ignore us a little bit because they're Ruby and stuff, and there was some other tool they rolled out, and I pointed out that despite the fact that even though Ruby was quite a minority language by comparison to C#, Ruby had full support for all the stuff, and C# had nothing. So what we should all do is go on there and request, because it says what language you're interested in, all request the C# code spaces happen, just to basically make sure. Otherwise, it'll roll out and it will, all the Ruby devs will have one, and we won't have it at all for C#. So, and F# too, all the F# team go in and request F# support for that. You have to put F# under other. So you may want to just complain to GitHub about being classed as other, because, I know how you feel about that.
It's really strange that because obviously Microsoft have bought out GitHub now, that .NET wouldn't be high up.
I think it's because it's still an arm's length company, right? Which I think everyone wanted, Microsoft to do, to keep GitHub to fund it, but keep it a lot more as an arm's length kind of like company. But yeah, the kind of like the influence on GitHub in terms of basically making it more C# friendly as an org, still not quite there, I don't think.
So I've actually been a bit rubbish because I completely forgot to ask Ian about doing a dev tip. And so I thought, oh, we'll skip it this time. So I didn't think of one. And Ian was just like extra Boy Scout and had been on the podcast guest FAQ webpage, which mentioned the dev tip, and thought of one. So in fact, I'm going to be cheeky and pinch that Code Spaces one, because so we've got a dev tip each there. I'll include links to both. What was the extension you mentioned?
Guitarco.
Guitarco and Code Spaces in the show notes. So where's the best place the folks at home can keep in touch with you?
So I'm iCooper on Twitter, and that's one of the easiest ways to get in touch with me. My DMs are open. I do try and answer simple enough queries and questions about stuff like TDD or messaging. If it gets really complicated, I just might not have the time to answer your stuff, but I'll try my best if you to DM me. That's the easiest way. And my GitHub repo, which I'll give you a link to, Dan. All the presentations I do go in a folder there. Don't clone the folder, because it's had lots of stuff in it over time, including video, etc. So it will consume your hard disk. But you can get what you need out of there. All my content tends to be made publicly available. And I've got a YouTube, I don't know, I guess it's a subscription or something that you can basically find. I can give you that as well. It has most of my talks when they appear at conferences. I put them in that list there, so you can track it down there.
Cool. I can include in the show notes anything we've spoken about, so any videos or links that we've mentioned throughout the episode. So a big, massive thank you, Ian, for joining us. It's been amazing having you on.
Hey, nice to see you again, Dan. Hopefully we'll be able to do it in person sooner or later again.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's been, I lose track to because of like Zoom and meetups and things all being virtual, I lose track to when I actually last met someone in person versus virtual.
Yeah, I mean, it could have been like a DDD for us, or I must have come up to Oxford at some point.
Yeah, you've been at Oxford a couple of times now, and then, as you say, like DDDs. The last one was probably one of the DDDs, I would imagine.
I'd guess so, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting with Jess's DDD. Which one is it?
Nottingham, yeah. East Midlands it's called, isn't it?
Yeah, that one being in person. Is it October, I think?
It is, yeah. I'm pretty hopeful that may actually happen, provided the vaccines hold up. That's the thing. I guess if we get a variant that breaks loose, that essentially the vaccines are, only 50% effective or whatever against, that's probably going to kill in-person events. But otherwise, I reckon it's probably okay.
Yeah, I think another factor might be that people being nervous about attending that kind of event. But it sounds like when they released their tickets, it pretty much sold out straight away. So it sounds like that's not a problem.
Yeah, I haven't got a ticket because I didn't spot the tweet, so
Oh no.
I, I'd have to wait for another wave, or I have to basically hope that someone picks my talk.
Yeah, I must admit, I didn't grab a ticket because I've got to be honest, I'm kind of probably in the more nervous camp. I have had my first jab, I've not had my second one yet. So, and I kind of almost feel like we're in a window at the moment where they started off vaccinating, like rightly so, the more
Mm,
elderly population, the more vulnerable, which obviously is rightly so. But it's the younger people that are probably spreading the virus, and they haven't been
yeah,
vaccinated at this point. So there's this small window where lockdown's easing and the people that are spreading the virus, the younger people, haven't been vaccinated yet. Where it's this window, and then we've got this new variant. So this is kind of like, it feels like this is kind of at such a critical point. And but hopefully by October
yeah.
we'll know what's happened there.
To me, I think yeah. I mean, I think June's a bit early. To me, what it really felt like they should be waiting to do is certainly at least all the adult population has been offered 2 jabs before we really open up, because it feels like at that point you're getting pretty close to herd immunity at 70%, where even if you get an outbreak, it won't travel very far. So for all the people that essentially can't take the vaccine or for whom the vaccine didn't work, the odds of you being a person for who didn't hasn't had a successful vaccination then encountering COVID in the wild reduce because one person gets it, another person gets it, but then it stops because everyone around them is successfully vaccinated and it can't spread. That to me feels like the critical point because then you do have a risk. You have a risk that basically you're vulnerable, you don't have antibodies, even though you've been vaccinated, and you go to an event and you meet that one person who's carrying COVID, right? But hopefully that's a pretty small set of odds and much less risk than other things we do in our lives on a day-to-day basis, such that you begin to get on with life. But yeah, I think only half the population with 2 jabs, I feel that feels like it's too early to do indoor, in-person, more significant stuff. To me, I even restaurants and bars, I'm a little bit like, how much of that do I want to do in person?
What are your thoughts with, 'cause obviously you run London.net, with getting that back in person?
So I think we probably will. The interesting thing that happened, London's got two interesting problems at the minute. First one is when Skills Matter shut, we lost our venue. Skills Matter exists again, but I don't know what will happen. And Code Node exists, but I'm not quite sure post-pandemic what state of a play effectively is and whether we can use that. We could use Microsoft Reactor, but it's a more complicated booking process. That's the first one. The second one is that there's obviously one of the, is it Hainton or whatever, effectively, etc. One of the recruitment agencies effectively has got a London.net user group started. So what happens when Skills Matter effectively was struggling a bit, they sold off. There was basically a meetup for London.net that they had, which effectively was been done as a workaround so that they could get hold of our mailing list. We couldn't give it to them. We were at their venue. So basically they advertised a lot of the stuff on that group, so people join that group. They effectively sold it to a recruitment company. And that recruitment company started a .NET user group using that mailing list, calling themselves London.net. So then we had whole brand confusion, basically. And of course, they effectively have money, so they already have a venue, that kind of thing. So we're a little bit kind of like got kicked in the teeth by that a bit. So one of the things in the pandemic we've done is switch to what I call London Calling, which is much more open space style events. Because A, it helps differentiate us, and B, it's kind of nice to effectively meet your colleagues and chat, peers and chat about stuff. So the question for us after the pandemic is, do we go back to effectively and compete head on with them because we can get a venue and essentially have a second London.net meetup, which we could do. We talked to them. One of the reasons I was cross with them was I said, if you come and talk to us, we could have said, hey, London's a big city. We've traditionally been in the East. Why don't you do the West? Then people basically live in working in different parts of London can go on different nights to places. They didn't negotiate, talk to us at all. So one alternative is to basically say, well, rather than do that, we'll continue. We'll start running open spaces events the whole time. So we'll just switch to open spaces style, create the agenda, have a meeting, be more peer to peer. I don't know that's actually what we want to do, but we may mix the two more. But I suspect probably we would go back to in person, either to do that or something else. But my mental target time is more September, October, and part of it is also venues opening to make that possible, right?
One problem, well, not problem, one thing we need to think about as well is when we do start opening up, we've actually now got quite a few more members that couldn't make an in-person event. There's one guy that always joins us from America, and he joins us in the virtual pub session afterwards. And to suddenly get rid of virtual and go in person excludes a lot of new members. So we kind of, if we do go in person, we would still want to have some form of virtualness to it, whether it's like a webcam at the event and then a screen with like the Zoom matrix up there. I'm not sure yet.
So one of the reasons I was thinking about going to open spaces was, I think that as well, which was, I am suspicious that a lot of user groups and stuff like that will decide that being online is really helpful. Because also, I mean, even personally speaking, I'm working from home a lot. I'm not going into London a lot, right? I don't think my future is commuting into London every day anymore. In fact, we're thinking of buying slightly outside London, a bit further away, because I may be willing to commute more. And that means, an in-person user group may really suffer on the basis that, why am I going into town to go to a user group? Whereas virtual user groups don't suffer from that problem at all. But if you do open spaces more, that tends to be you're doing something where effectively it's more, hey, let's meet up and do something peer-to-peer. So it kind of depends. If you're maximizing the use of person-to-person stuff, that may help. But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, in some ways, it's nice to, we hold our open spaces event. People like Dave Evans come to them all the time. Would he come to all of them down from Birmingham if we were holding in London? I don't know. So yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting question. I think as more people end up being remote.
Yeah, I definitely don't want to go back now. I've got my office at home. I'm quite fortunate that I've got like a dedicated office, and I've invested in like quite decent equipment, like standing desk and decent machine and things. And I don't want to commute every day. I don't want to go and sit at a cookie-cutter desk. I don't know. It's just I like my home office. I've got my kitchen through there, which I can go and use. It's kind of, I think things like Zoom and Teams and these video conferencing call things, people are used to them. And to me, when you've got your webcams on, it feels pretty face-to-face.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's definitely these hybrid models in the base where you effectively, I mean, one option for lots of people could be something like, we all get together and we say, oh, I tell you what, let's organize, virtual stuff. And then every so often we'll do something like an in-person open space for people that want to meet up in a given area to have a pub night to meet up in a given area, right? I mean, that's definitely an option. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said potentially for a .NET user group that's a UK .NET user group that's virtual. And then organizing chapters of that say, hey, we're going to have an in-person drink up, or we're going to have an in-person open spaces event down in our area or whatever. I mean, that's definitely an interesting idea, right? Because then we probably get a lot of more critical mass in those meetings. So rather than being .NET Oxford, you become, UK.NET or whatever, effectively. You say, hey, we're just holding virtual user group meetings for everybody, UK or not, you're abroad. We're just talking about, where the organisers are, but we'll organise local meetups where you are and that kind of thing. I mean, it definitely might work.
When it's virtual only, the whole .NET location, so .NET Oxford, .NET Southwest, .NET, etc., the locations are relevant.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Anyway, I'm not sure whether this is actually part of the podcast. It's probably interesting to include it, but we should probably wrap up.
Yeah.
A big thank you, everyone, for listening, and a quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you are enjoying the podcast, please do help me spread the word on social media. I normally use the hashtag #unhandledexception, and I can be found on Twitter @Drakan, and my DMs are open. And my blog, danclark.com, has links to all my social stuff too. And we will include links to all the things we've mentioned today in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.